Saludos cordiales a toda nuestra audiencia. Este es otro episodio de La Trinchera con Christian Sobrino y me complace mucho de nuevo ofrecerles esta semana algo diferente en lo que es típicamente el mundo de podcast en Puerto Rico y lo que ha sido hasta ahora La Trinchera. Vamos a estar entrevistando a alguien que fue mi colega y muchas veces oponente de debate en la Junta de Supervisión Fiscal. Se llama Andrew Biggs. Él es un, no diría académico, pero un estudioso de un think tank en Washington, D.C. y en los Estados Unidos. Y vamos a conducir la entrevista en inglés. Así que por eso les digo que hay algo nuevo. El punto de La Trinchera es abrir estos espacios de discusión y procurar diálogos que antes no teníamos en la discusión pública en Puerto Rico. Así que, dicho eso, me place introducir a Andrew Biggs. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. It's going to be fun.
It's nice to catch up again.
Definitely. So, Andrew, I think one of the reasons I invited you on La Trinchera is I saw a little hoopla over a presentation, or it was a seminar, I think, that was hosted by the Harvard Kennedy School that was titled, I believe it was titled Puerto Rico Post-Bankruptcy, Economic Outlook. And it was a couple of weeks ago. And some of the comments you made there caused a little ire amongst our political leaders. You had bipartisan support against you. How do you feel about that, bringing people together?
I'm like George W. Bush. I'm a uniter, not a divider.
Are you a decider?
No, I'm not a decider. I wish I were, I guess, but no, it's I don't have a sort of set remarks on it, but I'll say in a way, some of this got interpreted as, I've got a beef with the governor or the administration or something like that. And, I certainly have, complaints. I'll be honest about that. But at the same time, my issue, I think I said this in the Harvard presentation, my issue is really with a sort of a political system that doesn't care that much about the day-to-day concerns that affect the lives of people in Puerto Rico. It's when I say this, I'm not, it is very easy to come across as condescending or demeaning. The gringo comes in, acts like he knows everything. He's telling you Puerto Ricans, you don't know what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not really it. I mean, all the problems Puerto Rico has, you can find in any state. You can find them in the federal government. I just think they're bigger and they're worse in Puerto Rico than they are elsewhere. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this. Say I've worked, for years on fixing the Social Security system in the United States. That's something where we could have fixed it 30 years ago. We know exactly what the problems are. And the reason we haven't done anything in 30 years is entirely down to politicians not wanting to do difficult things. They're not going to want to tell Americans you got to pay more taxes or get lower benefits. They don't want to deliver bad news to people. They're just doing what is best for them in the short term, but what is not best for America in the long term. And the issue I have is Puerto Rico is similar kinds of things. And so I think it's just easy to come off as condescending to Puerto Rico when that's not your intent. The real issue I have is just, we've been doing this for 5 years. And, the issues I bring up, okay, the education system doesn't work very well, or the business environment isn't very good, or the labor market is terrible. Those are all things we've been talking about for 5 years. And at some point you lose patience, not that it hasn't been fixed or that hasn't been fixed the way I want it to be fixed. I understand that's not going to happen. Where I lose patience with is when people stop seeming to care. And if you want, I'll just give you an example I raised in that Harvard event looking at educational results in Puerto Rico. Here I was looking at the federal test of student achievement. It's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. And that's done all around the country, including in Puerto Rico. Let me just give you some context on that. You could look at a city like Baltimore, with Baltimore, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., low-income city, reputed to have, the worst public education system in the United States. Have you ever seen that HBO show, The Wire? That takes place in Baltimore. Okay, so there's Baltimore for you.
And isn't there another series that I think it was also the same creators did a show called A Good Man's Hard to Find? I think it was also set in Baltimore.
Okay, but there's an earlier TV show called Life on the Street, which is also Baltimore. But it's a gritty, difficult place. So anyway, we're looking at Baltimore. If you look at fourth graders in Baltimore on the federal math test, I think it's 47% of them get the lowest possible score on the test. It's on a 1 to 4 scale, and they get the lowest possible score, which means below basic. They're not even at the basic level; they're the below basic level. So 47% of them are the below basic in math. And people say, this is just criminal what you're doing. Now let's look at Puerto Rico's public schools. 91% of fourth graders are below basic in math. There's almost no one in the public schools who is proficient in math, much less advanced in math. Almost no one is proficient in math. And so, and then this has come up in the past where people have these exotic ideas for what we want to do in Puerto Rico, and everybody's kid teach them Mandarin or cryptocurrency or whatever. And my point is, if you are not teaching kids at even the basic level to do math, to read and to write, all this other stuff is a pipe dream. And so it is the statistics like that, where Puerto Rico has twice the level of, basically the worst American city or mainland city of kids who are below basic in math. And you can look at other test scores and give you the same basic, outcome. And I get to the point of like, what are we going to do about this? Does anyone care?
Well,
that's where my frustration comes. Does anybody really care?
Let me stop you there and interject a little, because I think what you just said, there's a lot to unpack, but I'm pretty sure there's a good size of my audience that what they just heard is Andrew Biggs thinks we should stop dreaming when you made the reference to the pipe dream, right? So I was on a show, on a radio show, I was telling you before we stopped recording, and the person was like significantly and visually very frustrated with your comments that got picked up in Nuevo Dia. And I told them in the middle of the show, I say, nobody's gonna accuse me of being an FOMB toady, but to be fair to Andrew, like, he's not being personal against us. This is stuff that he thinks and he writes about and studies for the whole U.S., right? Both at the federal and the state level. And there is also something that I do that I've always identified in how you speak, and is that you're a policy wonk. You're kind of like this policy wonk from the early aughts, late 90s, the West Wing generation. And people don't really understand what you do, because down here, everybody knows you as one of our FOMB colonial overlords that's trying to empty the island so that some colonizers can come in. I mean, that's a caricature, right? That's been put out there. And people don't understand exactly what's your day job. Like, how do you know about this stuff, and what gives you authority to even comment on them? So I think what's your case? What's your day job, and what have you been doing?
Well, my day job is where I actually get paid a salary, since we don't get paid anything for the oversight board. I think there's this assumption that everybody's making some money, but we're not. My day job is I work at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the American Enterprise Institute. Essentially, I'm an economist working on retirement and pension issues. My background, I did most of my college and grad school in the UK. But then when I came back from there, I moved to Washington, D.C., worked on Capitol Hill for a little while, worked at a think tank, worked in the Social Security Administration in their policy office, doing kind of computer modeling sort of stuff, looking at Social Security. Spent a year when President George W. Bush in 2005 was doing Social Security reform, trying to fix the Social Security program. I went over to the White House, spent a year or so there. I was kind of the in-house sort of number cruncher on that kind of stuff. Since then, I went to the American Enterprise Institute. I've been there about 10 years. Obviously, I do things like Social Security. I do a lot of stuff on state and local government pensions, which is how I ended up on the oversight board. Around the country, there isn't a pension system in state and local government which would be considered well-funded by private sector standards. They're all a mess. And I think when they were looking for people to serve on the oversight board, from a policy background, obviously having insolvent pension systems for public employees was a big factor in Puerto Rico's fiscal situation. And they were, I think, looking for somebody who had that background. And there are not too many people who work in Washington, D.C. who have a strong background in these state and local government pensions. Often those people actually work out in the states. I happen to work in D.C. And that's how my name kind of got into the mix. But, I do work on a lot of, my day job I almost never say anything about Puerto Rico because it's just a separate stovepipe. But my day job, I'll write about pensions in New Jersey or Illinois or all these states have enormous problems with things. And, if you are a policy wonk, the way you talk does tend to be very
sanctimonious.
Sanctimonious, that is the word I was searching for. So it's in a sense, the charitable interpretation is not that I am prejudiced against Puerto Ricans, it's that I'm just generally a jerk. But I say about everyone. But the reality is not that. It's partly is just the way people in my line of work talk. It's a very explicit kind of thing. Yeah. You just don't spend a lot of time saying, how do I make this politically palatable to people? You just say it. And, other people in the business know not to take stuff like that personally at all. It's not, that's just not how it enters in. But look, there is an element, if I get emotional on this, it's because it's not because I want bad things to happen to Puerto Rico, I want good things to happen to Puerto Rico. I have maybe some background. I have no background in Puerto Rico. I knew about the pension system before coming on the board, but no background at all in Puerto Rico. I don't have any position really on the status question. I don't have any position on different politicians or parties. To say I don't care it wasn't something I was involved in. So I think the idea that I have some sort of bigger ulterior motive or strategy on this. No, kind of what you see is what you get. And what you see is somebody who really would like things in Puerto Rico to be better. And what makes it upsetting is, the difficulty in doing that. So it's, you mentioned, dreaming and all of that, but what I would like the politicians and elected officials in Puerto Rico to do is, maybe they dream more. There's dreams about, we want cryptocurrency or whatever it is. These sort of more exotic things. But maybe a better dream was, okay, we can have a functioning labor market that provides, plentiful jobs to people. We can have a public education system that provides a decent education to people. And if you look at the education situation, it's not like people in Puerto Rico don't know this. Puerto Ricans are much, much poorer than Americans in the mainland, yet they send their kids to private schools at 2 or 3 times the rate of mainland people. Why is that? Because they know this.
Can you repeat that slower so people understand? Because I was actually,
I'm sorry.
I was talking about this with friends. I was saying the indirect tax that we impose on families on the island by having them send their kids to private schools that I'm saying like 95% sure that they would not send to private school if the public school system was not good, just merely adequate. It's a huge tax on working families in Puerto Rico because it's not cheap for us.
You have, again, I think the median household income in Puerto Rico is around 1/3 that of the mainland. And I think I'm pulling numbers out of my head. I think around 20% of children in Puerto Rico go to private schools. On the mainland, it's about 10%. Don't hold me to that, but it's some very big difference.
So twice the kids in Puerto Rico go to public school, to private school, than they would have if apples to apples they would be in the mainland.
Exactly. And the sacrifice that Puerto Rico families are making is much bigger because they don't have the same kind of money as Americans on the mainland. And so it's, these people, we owe them something. I mean, you shouldn't have to. I have no problems if people want to send their kids to private school. I mean, a variety of reasons people do that. But if just statistically you send your child to a public school and there is a practically zero chance that child is going to come out proficient in math or English or Spanish for that matter, because all these tests, the federal tests are taken in Spanish, they're not taken in English. But if you get essentially an almost zero chance your child's going to come out learning the things you expect them to learn, it just, I know schools are dealing with a variety of other issues. I'm not putting it all on the schools, but there just doesn't seem to be any urgency about, hey, we got to fix this thing. And, part of this, and, if it seems I kind of made an outburst or whatever, it is just frustration of, I just think if I was as prejudiced against Puerto Ricans as people think, I would not think they are capable of better. I think Puerto Rico could be much better than it is today. It strikes me that a lot of politicians don't think that because they're just not as focused on the fundamentals of how you make this economy and society better. And so I think the schools can be better. I think the labor market can be better. I think the business environment can be better. I'm the optimist. I'm dreaming here, and I wish everybody else would dream a bigger dream.
So what would you appreciate is the difference between local politicians here, because you've put the onus on them a couple times in the past few minutes, and you also mentioned it in that event. And I remember we would always have the spat in the public board meetings where I would say, "I'm sorry, the Republican form of government got in the way of your PowerPoint," and you see that federal officials also put off, reforming Medicare or Social Security when you were there. And you have all other state legislatures and governors that also, Puerto Rico's special. I think we're the only ones that ran our retirement system into zero. I don't think that's ever happened before. Yeah. But I mean, in the U.S., you see states that are really putting in the effort to match our record, right? So what would be the difference between them and us? Is it just a failure of how these collective actions are taken in our form of government, state, like our basic state form of government, or is it something more, in your point of view?
This sort of comes up if I say things. People say, "Well, you're not referencing the history of the interaction between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, or the status question now." And those things, that's all true, and it's all things, to be honest, that the oversight board and me personally have steered clear of, because it's just not what we're set up to do. But at the same time, though, I think it's a lot of the problems you see in Puerto Rico are just sort of garden variety, maladministration or poor governance that you see everywhere. And so it is not that I'm saying, the United States, look, we're not Sweden or something where everything is perfectly fine. There's, a place like Illinois or something, there's a decent chance Illinois will go bankrupt, because for decades they've refused to fund their pensions adequately. Their pension debt is so big that if the pension runs out like it does in Puerto Rico, or like it did in Puerto Rico, they're going to be done. They'll be bankrupt. At that point, Illinois will go to the federal government for some sort of bailout, and the federal government will say to them, "Okay, we're going to do something for you," because the states don't have bankruptcy powers any more than Puerto Rico did prior to Promesa. So Illinois will go to Washington, D.C., say, "Okay, we need help." And Washington, D.C. is going to say, "Okay, we're going to give you help, but it is not going to come without conditions." And so it's a lot of people see the oversight board in the context of the colonial relationship and the fact that Puerto Rico, the status question. And, I'm sure that's part of it. But like I say, if you were a state and you went bankrupt and you came to the federal government looking for bankruptcy protections, they're going to stick you with some sort of oversight board too, because I mean, a place like Illinois is a known bad actor. They haven't done what they should have done. And in return for bankruptcy protections, the federal government's going to say we want some fiscal responsibility here. So it's a lot of it is people sometimes think that I'm coming in with some sort of strong view about Puerto Rico bad, U.S. good or something like that. But a lot of it is I just see the problems in Puerto Rico is very similar to what I see in my day job in other parts of the country. It's just not great governance. And some of the things are worse, some things are better, but that's the context of it. So I get angry when the federal government won't fix Social Security for 30 years because that's going to make things worse for me and my kids. I get angry if state governments like Illinois won't fund their pensions. I get angry if Puerto Rico doesn't do it. And so it's just, I think partly just seeing the context of what I work on, where I'm coming from with this. And so I know it's hard for what I do or say not to come across as condescending sometimes, partly because of the way I speak, but also because I'm not Puerto Rican. Fine, I get that. I understand. But it is not intended that way. It is when I look at all these things that could be improved, the issue, I just say it doesn't have to be bad like this. We can fix these things. And yet it's just year after year, we put out another fiscal plan that it goes through all the statistics and the benchmarks and all that kind of stuff, and then not much happens. I'm not saying nothing has happened. Certain things have been improved. But, on schools, this comes up in the actual comments I made of saying, I don't think, the education department has the administrative capacity to do something or other. I forget what I said. But we had a hearing, as of probably 2 years ago now, about education. And I remember we had a teacher saying, look, we don't have textbooks in our classroom. And at that point, our executive director, Natalie Jaresko, went, she goes through all the paperwork. She's like, look, we allocated money for these things. It's not like the oversight board said, you can't have money for textbooks. We allocated the money for it. But somebody out there has got to go buy the textbooks. And you hear this even today of school supplies and all that, where they think it's been ordered, but they don't get it. And so this isn't just coming from some preconception I have in my head about how I think Puerto Rico works. A lot of this, whether it's on the specific instance of education or these general perceptions, comes from talking to people in Puerto Rico. And, it's trying to address those concerns. And it just, look, if you've been doing this for a while, I've been doing it for 5 years, and it frustrates me that these things don't get fixed. Imagine if you lived in Puerto Rico your entire life. How frustrated would you be?
Well, I think that ends up explaining why so many people have left, right? Their frustration is expressed with their feet and on JetBlue flights to Florida, Texas, or where have you. And, that you see it there. They get there, and the first thing they do is put their kids in public school. And I think the only, there were a couple in our time, at least in my time on the board, there were a couple of areas where we had pretty good alignment and ability to work together. I think education, my only criticism there was I thought us in the administration, at least as a general whole, not individuals, and the board were being a little too timid. I thought, the Department of Education, there's no way you can reform that. Just break it apart, send the schools down to the municipalities or what have you, and then just have the mayors deal with the procurement and with actually setting up the schools and running them. And you can have a Secretary of Education that just deals with standards, like we need kids to be able to do X, Y, and Z by X time in their years, like, I don't know, first grade. And here are the tests that we need to make sure everybody takes to know that they're accomplishing their goals and they're getting taught correctly. And if there's a big issue, and then the school, the state can take care of the school specifically, or something like that. But I think as long as we keep this massive administrative structure that centralizes everything, it's just simply not going to work.
Education is a tough thing. You get the same thing at the mainland. Do you want more state or federal control versus more local control? And it's a tough problem to solve. But I guess just in general, I say this. Look, I went to public schools right outside New York City. My school was not considered to be the greatest in the area. I was perhaps not the greatest student in school. I went on to get a master's and a PhD from reputable institutions, that I got the education that I needed to get. And other people deserve that. And so it's, if they want to send their kid to private school, I'm fine, but they shouldn't have to do it. And that's the sort of thing that I just find frustrating. And, you find it, I know when you were working with Governor Rosselló, we go back and forth on, labor market reforms. And, but what I'll say, and this applies to education as well, is at that point, there was a clear understanding of, okay, we have a problem with the education system. We have a problem with the labor market. What can we agree on solutions? If we can't agree on solutions, can they get enacted? But there's the recognition, okay, we got a problem here that needs to be solved, and it's a fairly significant problem. And, if at least that gives you a place to really start working. And, coming out of bankruptcy, I think gives a real opportunity for Puerto Rico. It gives you the fresh start in terms of the debt load. But if, when I think about this, again, because I'm a policy guy, I'm not a bankruptcy person or whatever, I'm a policy guy, I start thinking, well, what are the more fundamental issues that made Puerto Rico so vulnerable in the first place? And it's just, the honest answer is that a lot of these institutions are just weaker than they need to be. If you've got
can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by weaker?
Well, okay. And this is where it's the fact that I don't work in Puerto Rico. I work in Washington, D.C. I think about a lot of, I think of Puerto Rico, but I'm thinking about a lot of other things. I'm comparing things. And people in Puerto Rico, understand, okay, the job market is not that great. Labor force participation around 40%. What they may know is, if you go back over 3 decades, that is consistently one of the very lowest labor force participation rates in the world. It's not just, not great. It's really, really low. And, you can account for the informal labor market. I don't think that changes it very much. Similarly, you can look on international tests for student achievement. Let's go to the PISA test, which is from the OECD. And there, I think it's among 15-year-olds, Puerto Rico's like 67 out of 72 countries they look at. Countries, regions, I know I want to keep my terminology so I don't offend people, but it doesn't have
Don't
to
worry,
be
you
this.
already offended everybody enough. It's okay.
I think so. So and so when you look at that, you just, when I look at statistics like that, I say, okay, this is terrible. But I also say there's a lot of room for improvement. That there's things we can do to move things forward. You find if you look in the World Bank stuff in the business environment, some of that has improved. I think a lot of it hasn't. And these are not things that you need. You don't need a change of political status to do these things. You don't need some event that's not going to happen. Puerto Rico has as much control over its education system as a state does. This is a local kind of thing. A lot of the business environment stuff is essentially under control of the government. The labor market stuff is largely, although the federal minimum wage plays a role on that. But these are, I don't want to get critical of the government. It's not, because they can't fix the status quo. I'm not blaming them for something they can't fix. I'm just saying, if there are things you can fix, let's try to fix them.
But what do you mean they're weaker in the sense, for example, I really liked a book. I think he's your colleague, Yuval Levy.
Yuval Levin.
Yeah.
Yuval.
He has a book titled A Time to Build, and it's about how institutions have been weakened by the performance aspect of our current culture and politics. Is that what you're referring to? That our institutions our public institutions are not involved in they're more involved in performance just because they've gotten caught up in the same things that other institutions have gotten caught up, or is it different? Is it that type of institutional weakness, or is it something different?
It's similar but distinct. I mean, Yuval's argument, it gets into things I think a lot of them are distinct to the federal government of power of Congress versus the presidency. And I think he thinks Congress should have more and all that. And the stuff I see with Puerto Rico is things, for instance, the civil service in Puerto Rico is widely regarded to be much more politicized than in the rest of the U.S. And I was just reading a study the other day from, a couple of years ago, just showing the ways in which, political influence and patronage can come into place in hiring, promotion, things like that. That is really absent in the federal government. The President of the United States has something like 4,000 political appointments he can make out of something like 1.9 million civilian federal employees. I think the number of trust employees in Puerto Rico is 9,000, and it's, 150,000 employees, something like that. So there's much more, just politics there. But also, you just hear these stories about, well, if your party's out of power, then you get sidelined and things like that. We've also had issues. And some of this played into at the Harvard event where, for instance, this is going back 2020, 2021, where the oversight before board discovered, this is Department of Education, I suspect is happening elsewhere, that the department's continuing to pay salaries to employees who are no longer employed there. These are people that quit and gone to other jobs, maybe they retired. And this has been going on for over a decade. And you hear about this, and the reaction is an acronym of WTF. Like, how does this happen? And then, so coming out of this, the board pushed, and we worked with the government, and we've made some decent progress on stopping that part of don't pay people who no longer work here. But then we had the issue of sort of absenteeism, of people who are still working but may not be showing up to work. This has been an issue for several years with the board that we've raised. When you were working with Governor Rosselló, we requested, and you went along with, okay, let's have sort of attendance taken at different agencies and just see who's showing up, what's going on here. And that went on for a while. Now it's essentially stopped. But one of the things the board came up with is...
So sorry, the attendance reports, we're not submitting them anymore?
They're, the last I looked at, 8% of agencies in the government actually submit the reports. When they started, it was practically 100%. So it's just over time, bingo, fewer and fewer agencies bother doing this. And so the board said, okay, we want to have what's called a time and attendance system. It's a little app on your phone. I think the government already owns this time and attendance system. I forget the brand.
Is it Kronos?
That's it, Kronos. Okay.
I used to use that in my agency.
Okay. So the government owns this system, has paid for it. And we're like, okay, we actually have to use it here. And so we looked at the Department of Education because that's where we knew these issues were happening. But again, I'm not picking on education. I'm sure it's happening everywhere. And so we've been pushing to make this happen. Most teachers are using it, but then you have administrators who are just signing blanket sort of exemptions or whatever for 20% of teachers, so they're not using the system. And it came up fairly recently. We said, okay, we support raising teacher salaries. We understand they haven't had pay raise in 5 years or whatever. And so, okay, we're fine on that. But part of that salary increase, we wanted to make contingent on actually making sure this time and attendance system is used. And the government didn't think that was worth the fight. So they went and used federal dollars that we didn't have any control over. They went and did a temporary salary increase without this requirement. We could have given a permanent salary increase if they'd been willing to say, yes, we have to use this time and attendance system. And, I don't know how to put it. It's, I think that teachers deserve a pay increase, and we're fine on that. I think we had a very similar number in mind. But I also think when you've got test scores like what the Puerto Rico schools are putting out, where virtually nobody is proficient in math or reading, that you want to make sure teachers actually are all showing up to work. If they don't show up, that makes it all harder for the other teachers. So I'm not, just saying teachers are bad here. I'm saying, look, if 20% of people are not there on the job, the other 80% have got to work even harder. Or if you don't have a teacher in the classroom, how can your child read? There's more than one problem here.
And I think, if you can't punch in your time, you should just get fired. Either way. Like, I don't think you should not need to get paid to get punch in your time. I think it's just basic. Like, I don't think that, especially in a time where everything is so troubled, it really does show, it does win a lot of faith from the public if you're able to just say, hey, we're showing up, we're here, we're trying, here's the attendance list, and can you please give me a raise now? That's good, but it should not be conditioned. Like, and this is something that, sometimes it was my pet peeve, this whole thing where people need to be incentivized to do the basics. That's like price of admission. So for there, I think the only mistake on maybe the government side or your side is having a discussion about whether it's necessary or not. It should be like, just a simple line in the budget, if you don't punch in your time, you're not getting paid. You're fired.
And so stuff like that is, again, the vast majority of teachers are showing up. The vast majority of them are using the system. And it's understanding how difficult it is to make certain kinds of changes. And I know I completely agree with you in theory. You shouldn't have to, offer a pay increase to get people to sign in to work. I mean, it shouldn't be that way. But if you can link the two, it does make that task a little bit easier. So we said, okay, we're happy to give a pay increase. They deserve it. Let's also tack this on, which is not going to hurt the teachers who are showing up anyway. And then we will have taken a step towards improving education. And my broad thing is, the reforms or the changes that are popular are not a problem to do. Something like when we think, I have this concern about the labor market and very low rates of labor force participation. Something like the earned income tax credit, that was popular. That's the earned income tax credit. It gives a sort of a wage bonus to low income people who work. And so it kind of raises their wages in a way. And so it's an incentive to work. Puerto Rico is not eligible for it because it's a federal program. Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income taxes. But
we have it now, though, right? So we have it now.
Yes, you have it now. But even before, the federal government, before Congress decided to do it, we favored having something like this. Well, okay. And, all the elected officials favored it too, because that's popular. But there's other stuff dealing with the labor market that's not popular. And, I'll just be upfront and think, Puerto Rico's laws regarding paid leave, the amount of mandatory paid vacation, paid sick leave, maternity leave, go way beyond anything in any of the states. Similarly, the law, I think Act 80, if I remember right.
I have enough battle scars from that one, buddy.
Okay. But the unfair dismissal laws, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2021, David Card, one of his studies was showing that these laws against unfair dismissal, making it tough to fire employees, also dissuaded firms from hiring employees. So all the mandatory paid vacation, that reduces wages because your businesses are not going to pay you for nothing. So that unequivocally, that's going to reduce wages. And the dismissal laws, that's going to reduce the number of jobs. Now, those are less popular. Those laws are popular, so getting rid of them or changing them is less popular. That we just got very little, discussion of. And my point of stuff like that is I'm fine if, elected officials or whoever say, look, there's a trade-off between the amount of paid vacation and the amount of job protections people get, and that's traded off against the amount of wages they get and the number of jobs that are available. That's the trade-off that the reading economics literature will tell you there is. I'm fine if somebody says, okay, we think it's more important to have paid leave and job security than have higher wages and more jobs. It's not something I would agree with because Puerto Rico has very low wages and not many jobs, but at least you're talking about the trade-offs there. But what I think goes on is I think both the governor and the legislature, they would like to repeal partially or fully even the labor market reforms that were passed in 2017, which didn't go far enough as far as I'm concerned.
And I think, I don't know where we are in the process, but I think there was a bill that was approved and sent to the governor for signing.
Yeah,
I'm not sure exactly where that is right now.
With it. But my point is, that trade-off doesn't even get discussed. It's as if, okay, you're going to get more paid leave and you're going to have more job security, and that comes at zero cost to anyone. Look, if those sorts of labor laws had zero cost in terms of the labor market, every U.S. state would have one. And in fact, 0 U.S. states have one. So something like that says this is an issue. When you've got one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the world, this is an issue you should pay attention to.
Okay, so
and I think it's not even on the table for discussion.
So I think there we should go a little slower because it's an area where people misunderstand that type of position, which is also it's my personal position on what should be the statutory framework for labor and for private labor laws in Puerto Rico. I think that it's just my personal opinion based on research and experience. The lesser mandated benefits you have in law and certain protections, the higher wages end up working themselves out to be. And I always give the example when I lived in Massachusetts and I was a student, and this was in 2002 to 2006, I made and I had a bunch of odd jobs. At one point I was a bouncer, I've been a receptionist, I was a telemarketer. I think
bouncer was your chosen. That bouncer was your calling.
Well, that's how I learned how to have a big mouth, right? So my salary on a part-time job was never less than $10 an hour, never. And then in Puerto Rico, getting to 10, it took us a long time to have $10 an hour be a wage that people get on office jobs, and there's a lot of minimum wage going on here. And I have always thought that the reason is we have so that you get a payout, an exchange, right? You get these benefits, but also then the employer has to keep their margin, and they do it through your basic wage. But when you talk about it, Andrew, a lot of people are asking themselves, why is the guy on the fiscal oversight board that's supposed to be handling the government even touching the subject? And it's a criticism that I have, but that I also have on the fiscal plans that have been approved over the years. They have these page after page after page of focus on structural reforms, right? They're very policy heavy. And when I say policy, I mean they involve what the social contract the general populace thinks they have with their government and with other actors in the society. And they're discussed in there, and they're even scored for their economic and fiscal impact. And it's a little difficult to swallow. I mean, for example, how is it that you can score ¿cómo se dice? Repealing Act 80, for example, the unjust termination law, the same way that you can score getting more Medicaid funding? Because the Medicaid funding, it's just cash straight from Treasury into the public, the general fund or whatever fund it's for that. But with labor law reforms, you have to make a series of assumptions that might not necessarily play out. And in Puerto Rico, we had this experience with I don't know what the term. There's a term for these laws in the States. It's when they require businesses to close on Sundays. And if they open, they need to pay overtime. There's a specific term for these because I know they were in Massachusetts for a long time too.
Blue laws, but yeah, I know the phrase you're like.
Yeah, so before you guys got here, I think it was in 2010 or something, we had that law and it was repealed. And the promise was this will lead to 25,000 new jobs. And people are going to get paid more because it's going to take the burden off of the private sector. And, the result definitely was not as promised, or at least as hyped. So it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to swallow why exactly those structural reforms, as they're called, are even included in fiscal plans or in your purview. And would they even play out as promised? Or are we just giving a windfall to some few big businesses that are going to be able to increase their margin on everybody's back?
Sure. I think it is a fair question to say whether, the oversight board should be even involved in these structural type reforms. And, I know there's, probably one member of the board now who just thinks we should simply be a bankruptcy board and do nothing else. Usually, if you have, say, a corporate bankruptcy, like a Chapter 11, where they're not going to just split up the assets and sell them off, where they say this is an ongoing concern. We want this company to continue. A bankruptcy contains both a process to discharge debts that we determine the company can't pay, but also essentially reforms to your business practices so the company then becomes sustainable. And the view of the board, both from its starting point and the majority today is that it should play a role in it. We understand there's limitations on what our powers are, and some of this is prodding, some of it is, it's a sort of negotiated process. But the view of the board is these things are important, and because one way I'll put it is, if Puerto Rico had the labor force participation rate of Kentucky or one of the West Virginia, a state that is among the very lowest in the mainland U.S., where instead of 40%, you'd be 55%. If they had that, I'm not sure Puerto Rico would have gone bankrupt. And the reason is because you just have a third more people actually working. That's producing tax revenues for the government. That's reducing the amount of sort of welfare transfer benefits that the government has to pay. So when I look at this, this goes to root causes. The proximate cause of bankruptcy may have been the repeal of 936, and things start going down after that. But there is the question of why was Puerto Rico in such a precarious economic situation to begin with, and so such that the repeal of 936 causes bankruptcy. And so I think looking more broadly at those questions makes sense. It's you want
that dog.
Can we pause for a moment?
Yeah, sure. Okay, we're back on.
Yeah, so I think it's perfectly legit to say this is just not the board's business. That's not how we interpret it, and I don't think it's how Congress interpreted it. And the way to think about it is ask, why am I on the board? I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer. I'm not a sort of corporate restructuring guy. I'm a public policy guy. And so the reason a person like me gets on the board is because Congress cared about these things. And so I think it's while people can differ, I don't think it's an unreasonable interpretation the board has taken to say these structural factors matter. They matter to the bottom line of the government, the budget, the sustainability of the debt. But at a moral level, they matter to what people deserve to have as Americans in terms of the opportunities in life. Now, a second issue you can raise is, okay, you want to do structural reforms, but what are the scores you attach to them? Is this the same? Do you score this in the same way that you score, new Medicaid funding? And it's obvious the effect of structural reforms is more uncertain than more direct things like Medicaid funding. And I completely agree with that. We have largely. I've favored, say, labor market reform, but I have not been the one who said, okay, here's my read on how much this is going to affect labor force participation or the economy or revenues. That is outsourced, to our on-staff economist, who's a former IMF guy, and he reviews the academic research on different provisions, and he says, here's my best guess how, adding EITC is going to change things, or how changing, labor market laws are going to change things. And, I think there's something there in the sense that he is, our internal umpire in that I don't go and tell him what numbers to use. So, he makes his best guess on those things. But on something like Act 80, again, I refer to David Card, who just, won the Nobel Prize. And,
he won the Nobel Prize specifically over that?
No, he won it. Well, he is best known for the minimum wage work, arguing that raising minimum wage doesn't affect employment that much. So he is not coming at things from what you generally regard as a right-wing,
libertarian
point of view. So he's not known for that. But, what he found is that, unfair dismissal laws on the mainland, which are generally milder than in Puerto Rico, those reduce employment by 1.5%, which, when you've only got 40% working is a meaningful number. So the point is we have estimates on this. I mean, during the whole debate over should we repeal Act 80, the legislature said, well, you haven't presented us with any evidence on this. We sent like over 1,000 pages of academic studies supporting our conclusions on it. And of course, that went unread. But, the point here is that this is not just coming from some sort of ideological standpoint, that, there really is a lot of research to back this up. And, I think in most cases, people in different places around the world judge the trade-off of higher wages and more jobs to be superior to more paid leave and more job security. If people in Puerto Rico judge differently, then I defer to that. I mean, we are living in a democracy here, but it's, my problem is not that people are judging these trade-offs differently. My problem is when people act as if these trade-offs don't exist. With, hey, let's just repeal the 2017 labor law reform, and it's just going to be good things for everybody. And well, no, you're going to have some good things, some bad things. Let's talk about both of those. And I just don't think that stuff gets discussed.
And I agree on I've followed the recent, I don't know exactly where the bill is right now, as I mentioned earlier, but I have followed the discussion around the 2017 reform and the efforts to repeal it. And it has been a shit show. There has been no consideration I don't think there's even been an attempt to consider whether it actually worked, if it was effective in preserving jobs, not only creating new jobs, and if removing it would somehow create more complications for new jobs. I mean, I can't believe that they're taking that measure like that. So I think what you're saying is that you're not against leaders and different groups making an informed decision saying, we know that keeping this law has X, Y effect, but we just think that morally or politically or for whatever reason, we're just deciding to make the trade-off, versus not having the discussion at all, not even considering, and then just trying to live a fantasy land where if it doesn't work out, it's somebody else's fault.
Sure. I mean, government is all about trade-offs. All the easy choices have already been made. The obvious decisions, those have already been made. Right now, we're at the tougher kind of decisions where if you want something, you have to give something up. And so it's just, I think, talking about those trade-offs. I think on something like repealing the 2017 reforms, you don't have that. It's just, okay, you're going to get more paid leave, or you'll have more job security or whatever. Okay, but there's other things going on here. And I find it frustrating when that doesn't get discussed. And, you find it's, again, I just think that it's important to be able to understand the gravity of some of these problems, and how much better things could be.
There's the Center for the New Economy, which I think is probably the only think tank that we have down here. I think there's a new one that's more, I think it's called Institute of Economic Liberty, and it's more down the line of Cato or AEI, but it's very recent. And I think there's a couple maybe of offices that call themselves the think tanks, but they really only have like 2 or 3 people. But CNE published a a highlight on the 2022 fiscal plan, and they had another set of criticisms on structural reforms, saying that actually the literature has said that they're really not effective at all, and that their focus throughout the restructurings in Greece and in other IMF restructurings was really the economic value actually came way below what was expected. Have you seen that? And because it's different from what the political debates were of whether it was good or bad, right? But their criticism is that it's not even effective from a policy view.
Yeah, and I guess a couple thoughts. One is, if you think of where the board certainly started out on a lot of these policy issues, it was a book that CNE and Brookings, the think tank, published in 2006, 2007. And, anybody who's interested should look at it. I mean, it's done by, mainstream economists using sort of mainstream methods and just saying, look, there's a lot of wasted opportunities here in Puerto Rico. I mean, when I talked about the problem of teacher absenteeism, I mean, that book, which is now 15 years old, described as rampant. And so it's, if I say, okay, we want to take attendance, the teachers are there, it's not me just concocting some idea that teachers aren't showing up. There's actually, and there's other data showing it. You have to find that book had good work on other areas like the labor market in particular. It's a real focus there. Now, where I think CNE is now, and like Sergio Marxwash, he was at the Harvard event I did a couple of weeks ago. I mean, great guy. I mean, it's a smart guy, produces a good case for himself. But they tend to take the view, okay, structural reform is not good. Industrial policy is where we want to be. And
what's the difference between those two?
Structural reforms are trying to create fertile ground for economic growth. It's not trying to say we're going to have this industry rather than that industry. It's just saying let's have a good environment that of easy and entry and exit for the market. Businesses can start easily. People can get in and out of the labor market. Essentially a free market where people's interests and incentives can work. So it's trying to create fertile ground for economic growth, but it's not saying what type of economic growth that should be. I've pointed to tourism in Puerto Rico, where I think is a place where Puerto Rico underperforms. I mean, I'm glad tourism is better, but here's the statistic: Puerto Rico has fewer people employed in tourism than Nebraska does. Nebraska is a very flat state in the middle of the U.S. that nobody I know of has ever visited for reasons of tourism. I'm sure. I mean, Justin Peterson, one of my co-board members from Nebraska. So I don't want to say anything about Nebraska. Nebraska's no Puerto Rico. I'll just say that. And yet Nebraska has more people in tourism-related jobs than Puerto Rico does. And Nebraska's population is a third smaller than Puerto Rico's is. It's like 2 million versus 3 million Puerto Rico. So I look at this and I say, it's just nuts that we don't have more people working in tourism in Puerto Rico. And this gives jobs to people today. It's not, we're going to create some new industry with new employees, with new skills. This says, okay, these are jobs that people in Puerto Rico today can do. They're generally decent jobs in a sense. They're great jobs for building language skills, which would be very, very helpful for future economic growth. But they're jobs you can expand today. If you're, I've been in Puerto Rico probably once a month past 5 years. So I spent a lot of time in hotels. One thing I've noticed, and again, this is just where it's helpful sometimes to be in Puerto Rico, but also be other places, is you go to hotels in Puerto Rico, they're fine hotels, they're very nice buildings. There's not many people working in them. And the best example, or the crazy example I have, is a hotel, I forget which one, in Carolina. And I go, I have my one afternoon off. I'm there, so I'm going to go sit by the pool. And I go there, and if you go to Florida or Hawaii or something, they have somebody working at the pool who gives you out towels. Yeah. So you have a towel. So anyway, I have a picture of it somewhere in this hotel in Puerto Rico. They have this robotic machine that gives you your pool towel. And I mean, it was unbelievable thing to, it wasn't even a vending machine, it was more sophisticated than that. And I say, why the hell would you have a machine do something when you could just hire somebody? But it's the same reason we go to the front desk of the hotel and you're waiting 10 minutes, or you can't find somebody to get you a drink or something. They tend to be understaffed relative to the capacity. And what this comes down to is their incentives not to hire people in Puerto Rico. Your paid leave laws, your labor laws, whatever, push up the cost of labor. If you're running kind of that sort of business that employs lower wage labor, I think it is cheaper, in fact, to hire somebody in Florida than it is in Puerto Rico, because things like paid leave and all that push up the cost of the hour of work you're getting.
Is that an assumption, or is it something that you've looked at?
I believe there was a government report at some point which calculated that several years ago when we were doing the labor law stuff. I'm pretty sure I calculated it myself too. Okay. So the point is, you're artificially raising the cost of labor. You're making it harder to hire people and fire them. And so, an employer is not going to take a chance on kind of a marginal worker, because if they hire them and they don't work out, it's going to be hard for them. So when I look at this, I personally say, okay, tourism looks like a place where you could expand, but it's not, in a sense, it's not my business what expands in Puerto Rico. Where the CNE is coming from is, no, government should favor certain industries or jobs and essentially disfavor other ones.
And that's industrial policy.
That's industrial policy, where you're picking winners and losers. And look, it's not crazy stuff they're saying. I mean, they make the point that a lot of developing countries use industrial policy. There are people, on the mainland of the sort of the Trumpy sort who think the whole U.S. should use industrial policy. But in general, I think the mainstream view of most economists is that's not the way to go, that you want to create fertile ground for growth and then just see what happens. And jobs I want to produce as many jobs for as many people as possible. So I'm not against jobs in high tech or whatever. Good job's a good job. I just don't think you should be trying to pick winners and losers. I think this comes down, again, this goes to the sort of remarks I made on administrative capacity or whatever in the government, that industrial policy demands a very high level of competence from the government. It demands a very, high level of integrity in the government. And, I just asked the question, I asked Sergio, if Puerto Rico has this industrial policy that you think it should have, are you confident this would be carried out, efficiently? It would be carried out without favoritism, but based on politics or based on some people being, insiders who might benefit economically from it? And I asked it rhetorically, but I think he understood that this is, in Puerto Rico, this is a danger. I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but the World Bank does these governance indicators of, one is just government effectiveness, which is, government's ability to formulate policies, to carry out policies, to have civil service be non-politicized, things like that. On that rating, Puerto Rico is like 91st in the world, below Cuba and Albania. So
I'm pretty sure the government of Cuba is very effective on inspiring people and doing what they want, right? They just put a gun
in certain ways, yes. Head. But the point here is, I'm not saying this I know this will be interpreted, I'm insulting government employees. No, the employees are fine. You just need to manage things and make sure really take this stuff seriously. And but it's also to recognize you are where you are. And
maybe that's also. So Section 936 was industrial policy. It was federal industrial policy for the benefit of Puerto Rico, in the sense that it said, we want manufacturing jobs under the American flag, but we're going to give incentives to locate them in Puerto Rico. And the trade-off was Puerto Rico is going to be less regulated. It's going to be its wage is going to be lower than in the U.S., and you're going to get a tax break, right? And Puerto Rico kind of mobilized completely to support that project. We did the whole government infrastructure right now is still based on the infrastructure that was built to roll out 936. And then we lost it in pretty quick way. And I think a lot of people that still remember those days have that hangover. They remember when there was industrial policy with federal partnership and it kind of worked out. You know, there's criticism to it because I've always thought that 936 was very beneficial to half of the island, and it allowed that half to ignore the other one that was not doing so well during those days. And I don't think we've gone full Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman here, but it's just that worked. We saw it. We remember that it worked, and the other option is still unsure.
Yeah, I'll make a general remark, then talk a little about 936. The general remark is that this goes back to your questions about the CNE saying the structural reforms don't work, and so I just went back and said, okay, let's look what the IMF has to say about, job protections like Act 80. And you can go back, even the most recent stuff I found was a couple of years ago. They were very clear that particularly in developing countries, excessive job protections cost jobs. I mean, they were not hedging on this. They were sort of unequivocal that reducing unfair dismissal laws is going to lead to a significant increase in the number of jobs. So I think their CNE's read of the literature may not be quite where mine is on this. I mean, I saw the report and they're quoting James Galbraith, who is an American economist who is well to the left of center. But I think where we try to come from is, my economic views are probably to the right of center, where I think we try to come from is sort of the mainstream on things. So there's that. I think that when we think about 936 versus, sort of general industrial policy is, the view of 936, it's like when I came into this, I talked to people, say, in the Obama Treasury Department who are, probably more economically progressive than I am. Their view, and others have supported, it's just an expensive way of creating jobs in Puerto Rico. That it's just for every job you created, the federal government had given out a lot in tax preferences. So in that, you say big picture, is that the best way of doing it? Probably not. But then what you have to say when you think of industrial policy for Puerto Rico is this is not going to be paid for by the federal government. It's going to be paid for by the people of Puerto Rico. So with 936, you can say, look, it may not have been as efficient as it could have been, but it was, mostly paid for as a federal tax preference. So, we're happy to get the benefits we get. But when Puerto Ricans themselves have to pay the full freight of, industrial policy in the future, we got to tax some companies more in order to give preferences to other companies, that's where you want to make sure you're really getting the bang for your buck on stuff like that. And I'm not saying it can never work, but if you think how taxes are done in Puerto Rico, where it's all these individual deals with different companies, that's just not how it works in the rest of the US. And again, people are free to do whatever they want. But again, this gets to my issue of, are we even discussing the trade-offs here? And the trade-offs are, if you're a company that's got a larger company, who got more money, more sway, you're going to cut a better deal than some local Puerto Rico firm, and they may have to pay the higher tax rate. And that's how these things work. And so, the alternative is let's just have a simple tax code with low rates for everyone and say, we don't care what you do. If you want to start a business here, that's great. I do tend to think with stuff going back to 936 and even in general with a lot of the stuff is trying to start industries that are very sort of capital intensive and technology intensive may not employ that many people. And my focus really is jobs. That is, and again, I'm not against jobs for highly educated people, but I think it's really at the sort of lower end of the income distribution in Puerto Rico where the employment problems are the largest. If you go to a middle wage job in Puerto Rico, accountant or something like that, they have employment rates which are similar to the mainland. It's just their wages are a lot lower. And part of that is because you have to give them 3 weeks of paid leave. But there, the employment rates are kind of similar. If you look at the lower end of the income distribution, wages actually compare pretty well to the mainland, at least to lower income mainland states. The problem is there are so few of those jobs. So when I look at this, I say, okay, we've got a lot of people who could have jobs but don't. What can we do for them? And if a guy who might otherwise, work in a hotel or something, he's not going to go become a cryptocurrency trader. This is like telling coal miners in West Virginia.
NFTs are pretty hot.
But you get the same thing in the mainland. I mean, it's, like coal miners in West Virginia get laid off, or steel mill workers in Ohio, the plant closes. People say, "Oh, you should learn to code. How come you don't know Python?" And that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that's bullshit.
Of course it's bullshit. So you have to match and say, what can we do for the actual people we have? And I'm fine on looking to the future, but what can we do to help produce jobs for the people who need jobs today? And I'm just not really sure there really is a vision on that. And so, it's fine to say the oversight board shouldn't be involved in that. That's a reasonable argument. And, people say, look, bankruptcy is done. Pass these things back to the local government, just let them figure it out. And they say it's democracy, and of course it is. Anybody who's not troubled by the fact that you have this unelected oversight board with such influence in Puerto Rico, I mean, you have to be kind of obtuse not to be troubled by that. I mean, I recognize I'm not from Puerto Rico. Nobody elected me. Nobody even in Puerto Rico even elected the people who appointed me. Nobody here voted for President Obama or President Trump. So I get this. I mean, I'm not an idiot. At the same time, though, it's about the trade-offs. And if I say, okay, how do you feel about the Puerto Rico board going away if there is like 0% chance these problems with education or the labor market or whatever are going to get fixed? And I'm just saying it becomes, to me, a different kind of question. It doesn't mean that I should be sitting as some sort of dictator forever, because I'm not a dictator, I'm only here for forever. But I think having people who are prodding the government to say, look, let's take these things seriously, I think that can be helpful, while understanding that in reality, the board's power to do these things is pretty limited. We can be gadflies. We can make a pain in the ass out of ourselves by raising these issues. It's more attention is going to be paid to education in Puerto Rico by virtue of me shooting my mouth off because it's embarrassing to people, than it is by stuff that's in the fiscal plans that the oversight board comes up with. So just shining a light on these issues and saying, yeah, we can do better, but we just got to take it really, really seriously. And so I think that's a role which I think it can be helpful without undermining the fact that people should have a right to rule themselves.
I think it could be helpful. I think sometimes where you guys have screwed up is when you don't realize that what you're saying is somehow getting intertwined with another discussion that's very local, but you just don't have the background. I'll give you an example. So the discussions we just had on labor laws and how they can affect trade-offs by firm management or businesses saying, I'm going to hire less people because even if the wage is lower, there's more legal risk tied to that individual, is very different than another discussion that sometimes is carried on island, where people will say Puerto Ricans don't work enough because they have too much safety net benefits, and we call it, the term is mantengo, right? They're maintained by the government, and we should impose some kind of level of precarity and true poverty that's going to really inspire people to get their butts off the sofa and go to work. And that's an argument that's been championed by people in the independent sector, in the statehood sector, in the in the Partido Popular, that's more status quo friendly. You could read, there's a lot of literature when the federal minimum wage was implemented in Puerto Rico, where they were saying this is going to be a disaster, and all these others, and food stamps, exactly, because they're going to incentivize people not to work. And that's like a very hot topic of whether, if there's this level of redeeming poverty that makes people work harder, which I completely oppose and do not subscribe to, versus the discussion that you were just having, that's people, rational players making economic and legal decisions. And I think that's why sometimes, things get mixed up when you're trying to call attention to one issue. Like, it's nobody, and the same in education, nobody can reject that schools are screwed up. Nobody can reject that there's people that need to make better decisions, and if they're not willing to make them, get their ass canned. It's just I think sometimes that those discussions get mixed up, and there's nobody there to tell you, hey, you just touched a third rail without knowing it.
Yeah, I think it's like when we write about these things in the fiscal plans, so you could go back to some of the older ones where we talked about some of these trade-offs involved for people who are on welfare programs, things like that. When we write about them, we'd be pretty precise. If I would tweet about it or just say something, then it often comes out as not as precise. And often the not as precise wording is the one that comes across as insulting. Thinking about sort of welfare benefits and what the Oversight Board has said is, and this would go back, maybe like a fiscal plan from 2019 would probably have a good focus on that. But what we look at, say, is the trade-off between work and receiving benefits. And this is what you call like an implicit tax, meaning, let's say I'm not working and I'm receiving food stamps or housing benefit or Medicaid or whatever else. If I go and I earn money, I say I'm going to take a job now, I'm going to get a certain amount of money coming in per hour. What am I going to lose then in terms of benefits I get from the government? And so the benefit to me from working is the wage I get minus whatever benefits I lose. And so this becomes, there's no value judgment here of you're a bad person or you're lazy or whatever. It's simply saying the way it's set up, you're telling people it doesn't make financial sense for you to work. Now, there's some questions about
people are smarter than other people people are generally smarter than they're given credit.
Sure. So it's something like that is not if this gets interpreted as, oh, you're saying Puerto Ricans are lazy or something like that. Look, if Puerto Ricans were lazy, you wouldn't have had 1 million people leaving to go to Florida or wherever for the express purpose of finding jobs. And when they go there, they do find jobs and they work. So if Puerto Ricans on the mainland are working just fine and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico are not, then maybe the problem isn't, the difference isn't Puerto Ricans, maybe it's difference, you have different policies. And if you have policies that make jobs available, create incentives to take those jobs, that's going to be different from a situation where there's not very many jobs available. And if you do take the job, you end up with less money in your pocket at the end of the day because you lose as much in welfare benefits as you gain in the wage. So it's a very again, this goes back to sort of what my job is as a policy wonk, where if the sort of things I've talked about with this, or the way we express in the fiscal plans, anybody who works in public policy read this and say, okay, I get it. There would be nothing there that we consider offensive to them. Because it's all about policies and trade-offs and incentives and all that. It is not about cultural conceptions about Puerto Rico at all. Because for the most part, we're drawing on a lot of literature and research that comes from outside of Puerto Rico. But I completely get how these things get, this sort of academic, researchy type argument something like me might make, gets mixed in with discussions on the island, which appear to be very similar, but might just be different.
Yeah.
We know, if poverty gets high enough in Puerto Rico, people leave in search of jobs and then they find them. And, my point, and I have no problems if Puerto Ricans wanted to move to New York or Florida or wherever. My point is they shouldn't have to. There's no magic that creates jobs in Orlando. Well, I guess the Magic Kingdom, but, there's no, it is just, just to make a comparison to Florida, if you think about what is required of employers in Puerto Rico, I can't get the numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like 2 weeks of paid vacation, another couple of weeks of sick leave, mandatory maternity leave, and then if the person doesn't work out, then it's hard to fire them. In Florida has precisely none of those things. They require like literally zero. And it doesn't mean that if you're working in Florida, you won't get sick leave, but it means that it's the market determining this. And that market, by and large, has come out favorably for people. And I think there is a view among some people in Puerto Rico, and in the short term, it may be correct, is that employers aren't going to give you a single thing unless they're required to do it by the government. And if you're coming from the mainland, you're like, look, it's just how the labor market works. The competition and all that will produce these benefits. But if you're coming from a situation in Puerto Rico, for as long as you can remember, these benefits came because they were mandated, then you might be skeptical. And just going back to what you said earlier about the CNE report saying, well, structural reforms don't work. I'm looking at some IMF research on these unfair dismissal laws, and they show the benefits really are large for developing countries. But then they raise the question, okay, if they're so large, why aren't they doing it? They regard it as obvious that you would repeal something like Act 80, but they're asking, why don't some places do it? And I think the answer they propose, which is reasonable, is that in the short term, some people might be made worse off, and they might not be confident those longer term benefits are going to come. We're telling people, look, we're going to take away your job security, but it's going to produce more jobs available to you in the long term. Well, they know one thing for certain: their job security is going to be reduced. Yeah. We know that. And do they trust that the additional jobs are going to come? And, the research shows they will, but it is, it's just human nature to discount those things which are less certain. And so I completely get how people are, on this. I don't expect the man in the street to be sitting there reading 250 pages of the fiscal plan. Oh, I'm going to review the research. That's not how things work. But what will be good is having a discussion necessarily at the governmental level of saying, okay, what do we think? If we could pass, whatever laws we wanted, what would they look like? And then, you recognize you can't. Again, it's a democracy. People have certain preferences, but at least get to some idea of where we want to go. And I just think not going anywhere, saying we're simply going to be out of bankruptcy, but we're going to stick with this. Otherwise, not anything is going to change. It just doesn't. It's not a very promising future for people. There's no reason why the average household in Puerto Rico should have an income that's 2/3 lower than the average house in the mainland, or a poverty rate that's 4 times higher. And the odd thing I find on this is I'm the one saying this stuff, and yet you feel like, oh, you're the bad guy. I'm like, look, I would like incomes to be higher. I'd like poverty to be lower. And yet that's just not how people react to things.
Well, you're just offering your slate of solutions, right? It's not something but actually, this is the last topic.
If I could just touch on one other thing, going back to the labor market stuff. I haven't talked about it for a long time, but I have this weird fixation because it strikes me as incredibly important. If there's one thing in Puerto Rico that I could fix,
express yourself, buddy.
It would be labor market, because it's just really, really messed up. But if you go back to the time we were debating all these things, there was you would get this back and forth on social media, and I would say, well, what you need is structural reforms, a freer labor market, less government mandates. Other people would say, well, what you need is really the problem is just insufficient demand. We don't have enough money flowing around. If we did, then the labor market would respond.
There's a great debate between you and Héctor Cordero. He's a professor. You remember him? He's a professor. For those that don't know him, he's also, like Andrew, very active on Twitter, and he's a professor at, I think it's City University of New York. And he published a very interesting demographic study on poverty in Puerto Rico that I think everybody should at some point that's interested read on it. And I remember it was one of these weird panels that we would do at the FOMB. Like, it was on economic development, I think. And you guys were going back and forth, and it was on this specific subject that if there's more money moving around in the economy and wages are higher, they'll somehow outpace these costs for the mandated benefits, and there will be more jobs. And sorry to interrupt you, because it's something that I remember that I would argue kind of in favor of that position, or at least recognizing that when we had a dramatic increase in federal reconstruction work after the hurricanes, labor participation rate did go up and unemployment did go down. And it would it's kind of, I don't know if it's a data point or if it's just a fluke, but it kind of went on his side of the argument. So I'd be interested in what's your counterpoint now.
Yeah, no, I was going to say precisely the opposite, in the sense that the argument, and Hector's a great guy, and that was the meeting I got to know him. We actually going from butting heads to having a very friendly and I think useful kind of relationship. I think he's a great guy. But the argument was we just need more sort of fiscal stimulus, and that will drive up labor force participation. And, I look back and I was like, look, the government's bankrupt. I mean, they've borrowed and spent pretty much everything they could. So clear, and there's a big federal transfer. I mean, the federal government does transfer a lot of money net into Puerto Rico. So if fiscal stimulus is going to do it, then, labor force participation will be higher. And I think we see the same thing today, where we do have a lot of hurricane-related money going into the economy, and labor force participation is still incredibly low. I mean, it might tick up a couple of percentage points, but huge amounts of money flowing in to rebuild things, and it's still unbelievably low. I mean, far below the lowest mainland state. And so my point is, I view that as proof that you do in fact have a structural problem where you can push money at it, but there's other things that are causing resistance against higher employment. So I regarded, when Hurricane Maria came, I regarded this as maybe a test of kind of where we are in things. When we knew there's going to be money coming in, I want to say, how's the labor market respond to it? And I couldn't give you a labor force participation rate off the top of my head, but just slightly above 40% now, I think. And the lowest mainland state's probably 55%. And you can look around and this isn't just a U.S. thing. If you look around Caribbean, you look around Latin America, they all have much higher labor force participation rates than Puerto Rico. So the question is, why does this happen? And, and it's, it strikes me as fairly obvious there are structural reasons for it. And there's a question of what can you do about them? And, something like the federal minimum wage, that is going to impact low wage workers in Puerto Rico. That's not something the Puerto Rico government has control over. Things like the labor laws, paid leave, it does. But this is something where I think the current situation now, just to my mind, pretty pointedly shows this is a structural problem, not a fiscal stimulus aggregate demand problem.
That's a good point. So the other point, the last question I wanted to bring up, or the last issue, is Republican form of government, right? I mentioned it a little earlier, but the whole idea behind Republican forms of government is you establish checks and balances between public institutions that are set up to protect individual liberty and try to forestall tyranny against citizens and the exercise of their rights. But at the same time, you try to set them up in a way where collective action is brought forward to address big problems and even existential problems, right? In Puerto Rico, I think my and I hope people that listen to this episode appreciate, my issues with the board have never been individual. I like you a lot. I like David a lot. I even like Natalie, and I would argue with her every 5 minutes. But it was my opposition from a principled view was, I thought Promesa, more than give us a day in court, gave up. It was a message that some people gave up on us using the Republican form of government to solve these big issues, right? Because the board, in a sense, it wasn't as strong as it could have been, to be honest. And you guys have had a lighter hand than maybe I would have if I was in the same position. But that's essentially what it does. It says, okay, you guys had your turn at the bat, but we're going to have to bring some outsiders now. Yeah, I'm saying that not more as an introduction. You can address it if you want, but it's not really directed to Puerto Rico. When you see what you've seen for public pension systems in the U.S., what you've seen in the federal government, what you've seen in education across states and in Puerto Rico. Is that assumption of the Republican form of government correct, or do we have a rocky road ahead of us when these issues start coming, when the check starts hitting the bank?
Let me give you an example of something that's from my past that nothing to do with Puerto Rico. This was early in the Bush administration. George W. Bush, put together this bipartisan commission to look at Social Security reform. I was one of the staff guys on that. But even at the federal level, you've always sort of entitlement commissions to fix Social Security and Medicare. It's almost a running joke. Hey, we're going to have a commission to do it. But if you look at the federal budget, you take Social Security and Medicare, that's most of what the federal government does. I mean, it made together, it's not over 50%. Yeah, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid probably is over half of the government. And when they have these commissions, it is an admission that the Congress and the presidency and all that, we can't fix these problems, which are not ancillary issues of the federal government. This is our core line of business, is taking money from young people and giving it to old people. And they're saying, and by appointing some commission, they're saying we can't do this. And we can't manage these programs. It's kind of like McDonald's saying we can't make hamburgers. Like, you're the government. This is in fact what you do. This isn't something exotic. It's like NASA. This is your core mission. And you're admitting you don't know how to fix these things. And anybody with a brain knows the problem is that it's not they don't know how to fix it from a technical standpoint. Everybody knows that. The problem is they will not make the unpopular political decisions necessary in order to fix these programs. This is all happening at the federal level. So, my point when I say politicians in Puerto Rico aren't willing to make tough decisions, it's not like some unique thing. This happens everywhere. And, you have the same thing, state governments where they should fund their pension systems. Illinois is going through this now. They're supposed to fund the pension systems. They don't. Politics says raise benefits. They do. It's crazy, but this is all human nature. Human nature is for politics, for politicians to do things that people like in the short term, but be unwilling to tell them about the long-term costs. I completely, and so it's not there's nothing unique to Puerto Rico on these things. But that stuff does worry me in the sense of, why can't we manage this stuff? This is, really just a federal US issue, but when I think about it, and I lived in the UK for a long time. If you look at other, at least Anglo countries like UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they've all fixed basically their entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. In the US, we don't. And I think part of it is these others are parliamentary systems where if you get elected to government, you form a government, you can essentially do what you want. And then the next election, people can judge it. At the federal level, it is incredibly difficult to enact large changes. President Bush wanted to fix Social Security. He put tons of his own political capital into it. Republicans controlled the House and Senate, still he couldn't do it. President Obama wanted to pass the Affordable Care Act. He had massive majorities in Congress. He passed it by the skin of his teeth. And I do think with a lot of these problems, at least facing the federal government, we make it too hard for Congress to actually pass legislation. And when you look at these entitlement commissions, it's always got something in there to try to bypass Congress, and force them to do something. It's a difficult situation for the U.S. because these are not unfixable problems. Education is a much trickier one because there's all empirical disputes over how best to educate people. Kids coming from difficult backgrounds is very hard for them. That's a really more complicated thing. But something like Social Security is a money in, money out problem. And, anybody with a calculator could fix it. The problem is the fix involves more money in, which people don't want to do, or less money out, which people also don't want to do. And so so it sounds like I'm just berating sometimes, elected officials in Puerto Rico, but, it's not like the U.S. Congress is better. It's just, it's bad politics to tell people they're going to have to pay more and get less. But with something like Social Security, the math says we got to pay more or get less. So why don't we at least just recognize it and get on with things?
Okay. Well, that's a good answer. Let's see how it plays out. So
I will never be elected to anything. I can guarantee you that.
well, you never know, man. Politics can be incredibly weird as the years go by, right?
Maybe dog catcher. I don't know.
Maybe dog catcher, or you can try out sheriff. I'm sure that'll work in Oregon.
Yeah.
So Andrew, thanks a lot, and please don't jump off. I'm going to do the sign off, then we can talk for a second.
Sure.
So esto ha sido otro episodio de La Trinchera. Les agradezco a todo el mundo por sintonizar. Si les gusta el episodio, por favor, compartirlo con sus amistades y con sus enemigos. Y por favor, suscribirse en Spotify, Apple Podcasts o en cualquiera de sus plataformas preferidas. Como siempre, damos crédito a Eric Harper por la música Spirit of España y a Claudia Rosario por nuestro arte. Nos vemos en el próximo episodio.